Bonjour à tous, nous nous retrouvons pour une nouvelle séance scientifique du laboratoire HTL et aujourd'hui, vendredi 6 mai, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Thiago Chacon de l'Université de Brasilia qui va nous parler de Language Histories and Indigenous Histories in Northwest Amazonia, engaging different disciplines and epistemological perspectives. Chers collègues, vous avez la parole.
Bon, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Comme j'ai dit d'abord, malheureusement, je ne peux pas faire la présentation en français, donc je vais changer au anglais maintenant. And I am really glad for this invitation and with the opportunity to show some of my research to all of you. And what I'm going to be reporting today is connected with the research I've been carrying at the Institut des Études Avancées here in Paris since September 2021. So I'm going to be presenting some of the results. You can ask me at any time for clarifications about some of the results, because I need to show you some results without really being explicit how some of these results were acquired, so we can have a proper discussion, which is the central discussion of my talk, which is going to be how can we explain linguistic diversity, engaging different disciplines and different what I call epistemological perspectives when we consider as relevant to explain process of linguistic diversity, when we consider the knowledge and the worldview and the narratives of the indigenous peoples that I work with as I do research in the Amazon. I'm from the University of Brasilia, and I do research in two Amazonian settings. One is the neighboring with Colombia, and the other with Venezuela. And I'm going to be discussing most of the issues in the Northwest Amazon, where we find the Tucanoan and Arawakan linguistic families, among others, of course. Okay, so this is the main questions I would like to ask for this talk. You're going to see it's quite broad, and I've prepared to talk for about 1 hour, and I hope it will all fit. So the most general question, which it tends to guide my research for some years and for the future, I hope as well, is what actually creates, shapes, and sustains linguistic diversity? And I'm interested to answer this question dealing with different scales, from local scales to global scales as well. And actually to see the connections between these different scales. And for doing that, I'm interested in using linguistic methods for telling language histories, internal histories, as well as connecting language internal histories with what we have been generally calling external histories. And in addition to that, how indigenous perspective can enrich our view on these issues. Just to let you know that the project I'm presenting is pretty much historically based, but is also concerned with the current state of diversity and also with the future state of diversity of languages and cultures in the world, and in particular in the Amazon. To do this research, we know we have to engage with several different disciplines or sub-disciplines of linguistics and methods as well. And part of my interest in this research is not just a theoretical perspective, which is the main topic I'm discussing today, but also my activity as a university professor, where I teach and communicate with all different kinds of people and indigenous people themselves, and the need to develop a research that is engaging of these populations at the same time. Okay, so we have different perspectives or models about what creates linguistic diversity or what shapes linguistic diversity. A very popular model a very popular model that has been developed for some time and has got momentum with the work of archaeologists Colin Renfrew, Peter Bellwood, and other, and Daniel Nito as well, although he's not properly an archaeologist, he brings much knowledge about ecology, from biology to linguistics. So a very common model is to say, okay, there has been an increase of languages over time, and by the time agriculture developed, we start to see a decrease in linguistic diversity as populations with agriculture, their population grow, and they have technological advancements that produce the need for migration, and also a success in replacing other populations that were not agriculture. So based on this model, we can see some tipping points in the linguistic diversity of the world, such as the Neolithic Revolution, and then also more recently with the age of European discoveries, globalization, and the prospect for the future is not great if we keep, this trend is maintained. There is also other models to explain linguistic diversity. One of them is by the Australian linguist Nick Evans. And in different publications, he has argued that perhaps much of the force behind, much of the mechanism and dynamics behind the creation and sustainability of linguistic diversity has to do with multilingualism and social identity. And then based on his research on Australian groups, he suggests that social exogamy and small and mutually dependent social groups might be the relevant social units for us to think about how languages evolved over time. So it's very different from the previous model, where we see a model of endemic migration and substitution of populations, which has been much inspired in the Indo-European perspective and other language families as well. And Nick Evans' perspective is more inspired in his own work with native peoples in Australia. So we see how local scholarship developed into more general models, and we now see different models competing or complementing each other to explain this broader aspect of linguistic diversity. Now, I would like to provokingly suggest another explanation for linguistic diversity. And this is not mine at this point. This is actually a myth, a narrative retold by the Desano people. They are people from the Amazon. We're going to be talking about the Tucano linguistic family to which the Desano language belongs. There is a moment in their creation narrative where all humanity is gathered in a place called the chant house, or the house of songs, of chants. And they were all proto-humans and ancestors to the various people that exist today in that region. And also the white men or the non-Indians are included in this voyage, this creative voyage of humanity as well. At a certain moment, there is a person they call Garpimasan, which means ayahuasca man. Ayahuasca, for those that are not familiar, is a hallucinogenic drink made of vines, and it's used in very important rituals to these peoples. And when this ayahuasca man was born, magic things happen. So people start to see colors and geometric shapes that will in the future appear in the basketry, so the weaving utensils that they do, as well as facial paintings that they use in festivals also appeared as colors in their visage. Now, with the confusion brought by this hallucinogenic drink, all humanity ceased to recognize each other. And this was foundational for a new social order, where they defined who is each social group in the region. Is a region with more, I don't know, more than 20, 30 social ethnic groups, each one speaking roughly their own language. So in this very moment, that's their Desano kind of Babel. They recreate social relations. They define exogamy, which means who can marry with whom, and also along with colors, geometric shapes, and facial paintings, language appears along the way, and several languages, one language for each social group that was created at this moment. So you can see some parallels with the Babel myth, but we're going to explore more aspects of this myth with respect to the social organization of the people where the Desana, to the area where the Desana belong. But you can see here that the Desano, let's say the Desano theory of linguistic diversity, engages much more closely with Nick Evans' theory than with Renfrew, Bellwood, and others theorists proponents of the farming and language dispersal hypothesis. So let's keep these three different models in mind as we explore. I'm gonna just use a few slides to explain a little bit of my methodology. Basically, what I am interested is to observe the connection between language change and social history. And for that, we need some kind of intermediate concept where we can actually see the sociolinguistics aspect behind language change, the context where this change happen, and also this context in relation to other social histories. Here we see the paramount place of linguistics. Here we see it's the openness of these models to archaeological, genetic, anthropological, and other historical science. And here we see a linking concept where we can actually have an interdisciplinary approach combining these different disciplines and epistemological perspectives. Yeah, in a mutually feeding way, as you can see from the model. So we can have data from social history to understand past language ecologies. This can help understand language change, as well as patterns that we discover about language change and reconstruction and contact situations that can be used to understand more about or other aspects of this linguistic ecology, which can also explain more about social history. And to do that, we need some models of how different disciplines can engage each other when construing these methods. And following Hawaiian recently passed away Professor Robert Blust, who worked in the prehistory and linguistic and historical linguistics of Austronesian, we can actually find different possibilities of how information from different fields are correlated, such as complementary aspects. So linguistics say something, archaeology says something, for instance, and both complement our picture of the past. Sometimes they predict the same thing, so they're corroboratory, but sometimes they also present contradictions. We're going to explore these different possibilities in the future of this talk. And it's important also to keep in mind that when we are talking about multidisciplinary or multi-epistemological models of the past, we don't have the very perfect model, or don't have just the most important voice. I think it's interesting that linguistics, archaeology, mythology, and other domains, they have their own perspectives about the past, even though the past can seem to unite them because it's a single line of history in some sense. They all deal with portions and representations of this past in a different way. So we actually need to understand what are they referring to in terms of things, places, process, and what we can infer from interpreting them all together to create a narrative that ultimately aims for coherence, integrity, and parsimony. All right, this was it for the background. I'm gonna explore a little bit some general aspects of Amazonian linguistic diversity, discuss some general models behind that, and that will lead us to deal with the Northwest Amazon region more specifically. So if you look at this map of the Amazon, all the languages in the Amazon are represented as in this more shaded colors. So where you have more languages, you have stronger colors. Where you have less languages, you have more whitish colors. And you can see that Amazon has specific spots of concentration of high linguistic diversity. And let's say the hottest area is exactly the Northwest Amazon, which we're going to be discussing soon. So it's an area that within the Amazon is already an area of extreme linguistic diversity if compared to other areas as well. Some of you might not be familiar with the linguistic diversity in Amazonia, so I give you some more figures. In addition to a very high degree of biological species, of ethnic groups, we also have a very high number of linguistic families in the Amazon, and especially of language isolates, so families with just one member. And almost 11% of the world's diversity of language families, according to some measurements, are found in this area. And based on archaeology, we know it has been occupied for more than 2,000 years ago. And as you can see, the diversity is pretty much concentrated in areas of the periphery, the northwestern and southwestern periphery, which tends to be one of the oldest areas of human occupation of this region. And some areas in the middle of the Amazon they have lower diversity, which also suggests different historical elements happening in this area when compared to other areas as well. Daniel Nitto, we mentioned Nitto as one of the developers of world models of linguistic diversity. He also applied that model to the Americas, and it's in connection to the Amazon. We can say that his model predicts that in the beginning of human occupation of the area, we had very early, very high rates of diversification of languages and groups in the beginning as people migrated to empty spaces and split from each other. Then he predicts diversity declines gradually with population growth. So population grow, people are not isolated anymore, they get in contact. So language contact is responsible to the decrease of diversification. And then he says the tendency of the Americas would be to follow the European or the old world pattern, where major linguistic families like Indo-European or Sino-Tibetan or Austronesian, these major linguistic families actually supplanted or substituted local populations, and they caused language death in these local populations. But he says in the Americas, this was incomplete. It never happened, because we had the European invasion of the continent and everything changed there. I mean, the diversification of indigenous languages did not follow their independent course, but were related to the issues related to colonization. Well, I'd like to propose a different look into this model. So complement, just like Nick Evans complement the model of the farming language dispersal hypothesis, other linguists, including myself and colleagues in the Amazon, we are actually trying to see if language contact has to be necessarily related to language homogenization or language shift, or we can actually see elements in language contact that can, in fact, show diversification. So the different model starts with about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, when you see evidence in the archaeology of population growth. And with population growth, we also predict more contact and more mobility of certain groups, but we are investigating exactly social processes that might have led to more language birth events, less language extinctions, and perhaps higher rates of divergence between these languages as well. And one particular area to look at it are some areas of high linguistic diversity, of regions of high linguistic diversity, which is the case of Northwest Amazon. So to give you a more clear picture, there are a few language families in the Amazon that have expanded much more than others. These are Arawakan, the ones in red you can see here, the Caribbean, which are in green, as you can see in these areas, the G or the macro G, which is in blue, and the Tupian, which you can see in yellow. Then there are mid-sized language families, like the Panoan in purple and the Tucanoan in orange that you can see here. The expansion of the major 4 linguistic families has also been followed by expansion of particular ceramic pottery. So it's important to look at 2 ceramic traditions. One is called the Saladoid and Barrancoid, and it correlates with the expansion of the Arawakan groups, the ones that you see in red here and in purple in this map. And also the ceramic called Tupi-Guarani or Amazonian polychrome, which is expanded by the Tupian language family that you can see in red here or in yellow at this point. We will come back to archaeology and ceramic tradition and historical linguistics just in a bit. On the left, you see a graph of population growth in the Amazon. You can see that around 1500 before Christ is where you can see a beginning of population growth after a long time of population decline. And then we see the growth. And suddenly around the year 0 is where you see a very marked pattern of growth that is distinct from the past. So the population grows more and more and more. As population grows, we would expect more language shift and extinction, but in a global scale, in a very general scale, what we actually see, these are the language families and hypothetical ages of these families. We actually see that most language families in the Amazon, they are not large like the Tupi or the Arawakan, and they are not very old. I mean, they are actually quite shallow, and their temporality actually corresponds to the time where we see this population growth. So at least as a start, we can see that population growth and agriculture, which has been present in the Amazon since 4,000 years, it's not related directly with language shift or population replacement, but it's also related with language diversification of most of the language families in the area. Part of this has to do with the particular family, the Arawakan family, which is likely the very first family that expanded, and most proponents would say that agriculture is related to how the Arawakan language expanded. It's part of the Arawakan package of social technology and how that added them to expand. Their peak, you can see in the shaded areas around 1,000 years before present, and their area got a little bit reduced by the time before the time when the Europeans arrived. And it's not just the model of Arawakan expansion. Although it's based on agriculture and other aspects such as trade and network between different ethnic groups, the key thing is that it did not produce population replacement and did not produce language shift. It actually created some sort of social and cultural bound to specific areas where these languages appeared, where this language migrated to, and also connections between these areas. Later, other bigger families like Tupian, Caribbean would expand into the same areas of the Arawakan and would reduce their area, but Amazonia and South America was sufficiently interconnected with the Arawakan previous expansion at some point as well. But it's an expansion, as I said, that is markedly different from our ideology or knowledge about the Indo-European expansion, for instance. Now, not only the major language family has a different kind of social relations when it expands, it also we also have in the Amazon, as I briefly told you, some key areas of high linguistic diversity. And it's not just the number of languages or number of language families that are it's not just the number of language, but also the number of language families that are highlighted in these areas as well. So there are areas of high concentration of both language and linguistic families. And each of these areas have different kinds of social and cultural relations. And part of our research is to understand what sustains and creates linguistic diversity in each of these areas as a way to construct in the future a more inclusive theory of language diversification in the Americas and how that can contribute to our view of the world, especially because I think I forgot to mention that, but the farming and language dispersal hypothesis, it doesn't fit well in two areas of the world, which is Australia, where the most diverse language, with the most dispersed language family is found there is not agriculturalist, and in the Americas as well. In the Americas, it doesn't work out nicely. And the theory of Nito that I just told you about, it's a way to explain why in the Americas the pattern does not follow from the pattern in the old world. Just to show you some of these areas, you can see a reconstruction of, let's say, a hypothetical distant past where every language isolate is represented by a dotted orange dot, the orange little ball, and the polygons you can see here are location of the major linguistic families, their homelands. So you can see that homelands and language isolates of the Amazon, they are all roughly within these geographical areas where we currently see high rates of linguistic diversity. So we can see how these areas have been diverse and have been diversifying for a long time from this small experiment that we see in the map on the left. And we can also see the current distribution of most languages and how some language families such as Arawakan here, it really expanded to several areas. You can see yellow dots all over, but some language families like Tucanoan or Panoan that I mentioned to you, its expansion is more geographically restricted, especially Tucanoan. It has about 30 languages and all of them are found in this area. So it's a combination by the end of expansion of a few families and in situ diversification of small and mid-sized language families that actually create this pattern of linguistic diversity in the Amazon. And as I said, one of the main questions is what exactly is happening in these centers where we see this pattern that is different from other areas of the Amazon and is different from other areas, major areas of the world as well. Or it's also similar to these other areas of the world, but we need to, this part, for instance, of some research on typology of multilingualism. And part of what I'm trying to do is a diachronic understanding of typology of small-scale multilingualism. Well, okay, now we go to the Northwest Amazon, the area I'm intended to talk more exclusively right now. And this area, you can see this map from, it's a map that reconstructs the occupation of the America, this area of of South America by the time of the arrival of the Europeans. And according to this, even today, we can count about 68 languages in an area of the size of more or less Germany, nowadays Germany, and 11 language families. Very many ethnic groups, more ethnic groups than the number of languages we actually find here. And the groups are interconnected by trade specialization, intermediary relations, ritual alliance to run festivals, but also warfare too. And the groups have different kinds of subsistence. Some of them are more intense agriculturalists and more fishermen. Others are more foragers and hunters. But in between these groups, there is different shades, so it's not very categorical what is. There are some groups in the middle that are not categorical, whether they are more hunter and gatherers or whether they are more agriculturalists, especially because crop domestication in the Amazon is very old. So every group has some knowledge of plants that are domesticated or at least partially domesticated. And most groups as well are organized in clans, and these clans are socially exogamous, so they need to exchange husbands and wives between the clans for the reproduction of society. But at some time as well, groups prefer to be endogamous. So there is also this continuum of some groups are more exogamous, and you actually see places like the Valpes area, which is just over here, where you see the linguistic exogamy. It's a famous pattern where you have to pick your wife or your husband in a group that speaks a different language from yours. That's in the ideology of linguistic exogamy. This is just a cleaner way to see the major groups we're going to be discussing. You can see the Arawakan languages in light green here in the south of the Valpes area. They are also found in the north. The Tucanoa languages are divided. You can see one group of languages here, another one here, and the Eastern Tucanoan group here. So a major divide between Western Tucanoan and Eastern Tucanoan. And in between them, we have smaller language families and two large language families that came to this area, but they are not very populous. They are not very popular here. They're more wide distributed elsewhere, which is the Caribbean family that I told you about, and the Tupi-Guarani or the Tupian family over here. Okay, so I'll be mostly focused on the relationship of Tucanoan and Arawakan. As I said, Arawakan, you can see in blue how it's widely found in South America, and the position of the Tucanoa languages here. The Tucanoans have about 30 languages, and the Arawakan have about 70 languages. And the Arawakan languages are much more, if you take the family as a whole, they're much more diverse than the Tucanoa languages. We know of quite intense contact between Arawakan and Proto-Tucanoan or Proto-Eastern and Proto-Western Tucanoan for about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And this process of language contact has also been shaped by ethnic creative process that we in general call Arawakization of Tucanoans and Tucanization of Arawakans. This is a neighbor net or some kind of network representation of the Tucanoan family and of a particular branch of the Arawakan family. I'm just going to go back here. A branch of the Arawakan family found here. So it's a very consistent clade of Arawakan. It's not just a bunch of scattered Arawakan language. There is a consistent clade of Arawakan languages in this area. And this is called the Japurá Colombia clade or the Japurá Colombia branch of Arawakan. And this is the representation you're seeing here. If you look at the two networks, they're kind of similar in a way that there is some kind of east and west divide that you can see here, that you can also see here. So this is Western Tucanoan, and all these guys here are Eastern Tucanoan. But you also see some similarity even in the eastern side as well, with some groups diversifying before a major radiation or burst of diversification in this area of the family. So part of the understanding of how language histories and how social histories are related is to understand the shape of these classifications as well. Why we have these long branches representing independent chains in Western Tucanoa and a split with Eastern Tucanoans? Why do we have this sudden burst of diversity in some part of the Tucanoan family? I mentioned this, so I'm gonna just say a few more details about the social organization. This graph here represents different ethnic groups and how they intermarry with each other. These are Tucanoan groups. So we can see that a group like the Tucano, it can intermarry with several different groups: Tuyuca, Tatuyu, Piratapuyo, Macuna, Desano. So all groups are in a very intense network of intermarriage, whether these groups tend to marry with people that speak a different language, like the Tucano, or they tend to marry with people speaking their same language, such as the Baniwa, which is an Arawakan group, or the Hoop, which is another Hoop group. So this system of linguistic exogamy, it actually comes from a more simple system of social exogamy. So exchange of people between clans for intermarriage. And a person growing up in these systems can speak in general 2 to 3 or to 5 languages, depending on how much his or her group is interconnected in these networks of multilingualism and social exogamy. But some people as well might be in areas where there is no such a thing as linguistic exogamy, and they tend to speak the same language with the people that they intermarry. Several of the things I'm going to be discussing are related to archaeology, linguistics, but also to myth and ethnohistory. As you can see, there have been prolific publications by the indigenous people themselves and by people like myself who work in this book with the Cotter and the Cubeu, where we published their mythologies. And their mythologies, it's not just narratives, but also there are verbal and non-verbal aspects in their myth as well. And the myths of these groups, the Arawakan, the Tucanoans, they're not scattered histories that the anthropologist makes a collection and finds a logic behind it. They're given already with a very well-structured temporal progression, cohesiveness and coherence between the chapters. And they're very important as well for a holistic understanding of these societies as they relate, for instance, the geography where people live, with the creation of social groups, and with things such as healings and disease that affect the individuals, for instance. So they structure pretty much the universe of these social groups. And they're divided in 4 main mythological cycles. We have the creation of the world, the creation of humanity and social groups, the history of specific clans, and the history of specific families, individuals, and lineages of these areas. And we're going to be discussing some themes around a few myths that explain the emergence of agriculture, the emergence of social orders such as patrilinearity and patrilocality. That is, I belong to the lineage of my father and I live in the area where my husband, so the family lives in the area where the husband was born and actually lives. And we're going to be also discussing some elements such as origin and migrations, kinship, and language. So I'm going to tell you a few stories here. So please, let's listen to a brief summary of what four of these stories. The first story is the story called The Quest for Pupunha. Pupunha is a palm that gives this fruit. It's usually called in English peach palm, although the fruit is not like peach. It's just similar to peach. But there is two varieties of pupunha or peach palm, a cultivated one and a non-cultivated one, the one that grows in the bush, in the forest. And once upon a time, there was a demiurge, a god, or a son of a god, and he was married to a woman that was a foreigner woman. And this woman and her father, they had agriculture. And they once asked this god to go pick pupunha. Instead of going to where pupunha grows as cultivated plant, he went to the jungle where he was more familiar. So the god was not the god of agriculture. This god was just, let's say, the first person that did not actually have agriculture. So he went to the forest and picked the wrong one. He was mocked. People made fun of him, saying, this is not pupunha, you cannot eat this. And they taught him what is pupunha. And he tried very, very hard to conceal, to hide seeds of pupunha so he could take to his fellows, which means he was not living with his fellow clansmen, he was living with the wife and with the father-in-law. Now, this myth then talks about a contrast between hunter and gatherer, which is the situation of the god, so more like hunter and gatherer, with his wife and his father-in-law, which are agriculturalists and fishermen. In a later moment, there is another myth that talks about a time when women were controlling the political life of the society. And this was symbolized by the women being the ones that play flutes of male that are today used in male initiation rites and reinforce patrilinearity linking of the society. But before, it were the women that were using it, and they were the center of power. So the myth talks about a reversal from matriarchal to patriarchal societies. We're going to discuss this when we talk more about the Arawakization of Tucanoans. And there is a very important myth as well, or collection of myths, which is about migrations. Migrations, historical migrations of the Arawakan and the Eastern Tucanoans. It's very important to understand that the Arawakans believe that they are local to the Northwest Amazon, while the Eastern Tucanoan believes they come from a different place. The Eastern Tucanoan and some Western Tucanoan believe they come from a different place, but the voyage is very different from the Western Tucanoan and the Eastern Tucanoan. So as a summary, I can show you the Arawakan voyages are a number of concentric voyages starting from an origin, which is here, and expands in the second voyage, and expands in the third voyage, and expand in the fourth voyage. But they are always concentric and they always return to the same place. But the expansion of the group here is related to a single place of origin. And all of this talks about the expansion of the world as an expansion of the Arawakization of the world. The Tucanoans are very different. The Tucanoans, the Western Tucanoa, think they come from some place in the south and walked up to their location nowadays in the north. And the Eastern Tucanoan have different traditions of anaconda canoe. So they travel through rivers in boats like anaconda and arrived at certain locations. One of these locations where they arrived was in the myth, the Sano myth I told you about linguistic diversity. So they arrived in a particular waterfall or rapids in the river, and that was the chant house or the house of chants. So the whole tradition of the Tucanoan tradition is a migration from outside the area to inside the area, while the Arawakan is quite the reverse. This is a very important topic because that's where we're going to find the contradictions between the mythological models and the linguistic and archaeological models. Okay. Now, to finish our conversation about myths at this point, I would like to contrast then what the elements we saw in the Desano myth of linguistic diversity and the Baniwa myth, which is Baniwa is an Arawakan group. So the Baniwa myth of linguistic diversity. I presented you the Desano myth before, and so let's remember what it says is that language diversity, so the emergence of several languages in that house of chants, was accompanied by the emergence of specific ethnic markers like chants, basketry, and paintings. Also, emergence of a particular kind of social organization, such as patrilineages and social exogamy between the groups. Also, with the emergence of particular ritual cycles or ritual festivities, which is related to the ayahuasca drinking. And also with some kind of dynamic of diversification, because after going out of this place of the house of chants, the groups did not stop to diversify. They were diversifying as the rivers go into smaller creeks. The groups were also diversifying that way, and that also correlates with the territory of every patrilineal exomic group. This is the Desana myth. If you go to the Baniwa myth, which is the Arawakan, there is no mention to linguistic diversity. No mention to the emergence of language related to the emergence of all different groups. Actually, for the Baniwa, only people that they consider part of their own ethnicity were born in their same place, and they expanded as people related by the same ethnicity. Now, the Desano do not marry people from their own ethnicity. They have to marry people from another ethnicity. But the Baniwa, as I was telling you, is endogamous, preferably. They prefer to marry people from their own ethnicity. And language is a very important aspect delineating ethnicity in that sense. So for the Baniwa, everybody that they marry with are from their own ethnicity. They were born in the same place, and they speak a single language. Their traditional name is Medzeniakonai, which means the ones born with the original language. So it's very different, these two myths, and they represent different realities. If you think about the expansion of the Baniwa and the diversification of the Desano, we have two models of linguistic diversity. One might be more related to the Arawakan kind of expansion, and the other, the Tucanoan, is related to how language and social structure is found in this region. To give you one more clear example, look at this Bara person, which is also a Tucanoan speaking group, and how he talks about language and social organization. He says, my brothers, so my team, my group of brothers, are those who speak my own language. I call the Tucanos, which is another group, just a coincidence that's the same name of the family. I call Tucanos brothers because we used to speak the same language. But now they start to speak differently, and they speak another language entirely. But we're still close. I still call them brothers. And for the Baniwa, for us, we are the Medzeniakonai, origin-speaking peoples. We refer to the Medzeniakonai as the 16 clans that make up the Baniwa and Coripaco-speaking nation. So language for the Baniwa is an emblem of ethnicity and people you marry with. For the Tucanos is an emblem of patrilineages, and not necessarily with people, quite the opposite, not with the people you marry with. Now, why is this relevant for linguistic diversity on a large scale? Well, we can see here that the way the Eastern Tucanoan and Arawakan people count their number of languages, this is how they recognize language border, is very different. The Arawakans in this region count 6 languages, and the Eastern Tucanoans count 18 languages. Well, they also have, although they have this marked difference in how they count languages, well, they have a very similar number of people. So the population is quite the same. And the average similarity, when we do a comparison using a Swadesh list of 100 items, gives very similar figures. So these languages of this area are not more diverse than each other on a quantificational sense. Their population is not different, but they have different attitudes or ideologies towards language. And as we could see, this was revealed by the different myths we were exploring. And then we can say that Tucanoans have a more exclusive language boundary ideology, which goes along with patrilinearity, but also segmentation, so division and dispersion of the territory, while the Arawakan are more inclusive language boundaries, which include people they marry with in that sense. And it's more related to, instead of segmentation, division, to allies and network. And these social principles we are trying to explore and how they reflect in more general process of language diversification of these areas. Okay, I can see I've been speaking for 15 minutes already. I will have to go a bit fast a little bit. I'm sorry for going a bit beyond my time, but I think in 10 minutes I can finish. Is that okay? 10 to 15?
Pas de problème.
Okay, merci. Okay, now I show you the mythologies, and I gave you some hints about the Amazonian linguistic diversity and the sort of problems we are dealing. Now I'm going to be quite specific to the prehistory or history in general of Tucanoan and Arawakan groups and their position in the Northwest Amazon, using mostly linguistics, archaeology, and anthropological information. Then we go back to consider the myths. We're going to see that some of them are complementary, others are corroboratory, but there are points of contradiction as well. So based on the way Mayan culture has been well studied from archaeological and historical point of view and linguistics, they have these divisions of the Mayan time. I'm still not happy with the divisions of the periodization of the Northwest Amazon history, but these are the categories. And here we have a moment we call the archaic, which is chiefly characterized as a time when there were no Arawakan languages around. Then the formative, which relates with the initial expansion of Arawakan groups into this area, coming from other places of the Amazon. So you see that archaeologically and linguistically, we cannot say the Arawakans were original from this Northwest Amazon area. We know for independent reason they come from outside. Then we have the classic period, which is when you have the Arawakization of Eastern Tucanoan, and the post-classic period, which is when Tucano groups kind of do the reversal with the Arawakans. And this probably has to do, and these issues have to do with how the whole entire system entered the colonial period, which is a bit late in this area than other areas of the Americas, and the effect. We won't be able to discuss all of these. Actually, I'm going to do a selection to illustrate this major process for you. And okay, based on models such as linguistic gravity, such as looking at the diversity of groups and finding the place where would require least moves, we can say that the Tucanoan groups are located in this area, which is much further upriver than the Arawakans, which were located in this area. The location of these groups also correlate with geographical or with archaeological sites from different ceramic traditions. So I'm using the shape of symbols to show different ceramic traditions and the color to show to which linguistic family they are related. So purple to Arawakan and red to Tucanoan. We can reconstruct the homeland of Tucanoans in a more vague area using linguistic information, and we try to link this to the archaeological sites that give evidence for a society that spoke a language that we can reconstruct, for instance, the material culture vocabulary, and see that what is found in that particular archaeological site is also found in our paleolinguistic reconstructions. So for homelands and ceramic phase we have here, and we also have some dates of ceramic traditions. I think there is one date that was missing here, but the oldest dates of the archaeology of this area is 2,800 years, similar to this place here as well. Then we have expansion of the Arawakan, as we're gonna see. This is the situation then in the Archaic period, and to show that there were no Arawakan languages here, we can look at borrowings, for instance, or the linguistic stratigraphy of borrowings between Tucanoan, Witoto, and Boro languages. And this can be seen, for instance, in words for name and blood. You can see the word for name, for instance, that Proto-Western Tucanoan and Proto-Eastern Tucanoan have words like mami and wame. Bora, Miranha, these are not Tucanoa languages. So, and Okaina and Witoto, Minuka, these are other languages from the areas, the ones in yellow here. And they have etymologically related words, meme, meme, mamu, imame. So these are borrowings that we observe between languages. One example of borrowings that we observe between languages before the Arawakan expansion. You can see then that probably this borrowing occurred in an area where all of these yellow, which are the non-Tucanoan, and the red, which are the Tucanoan, were spoken in a similar area, which is exactly what we find here. Now, the second moment is what we call the formative. And the formative is basically when there is Arawakan expansion. So you can see that this expansion can be followed by some dates. Some of these represent very rapid expansion. So from 2,800 in this lower part of the river and 1,400 in this upper part, we see numbers of other dates of expansion of Arawakan in very rapid different areas. So it's a very kind of rapid expansion of these languages. And we do have linguistic evidence of this expansion. So this line here, which should touch, get in contact with all the Tucanoa languages located in this area, probably already a bit diversified, that's true, but more like a linkage or a dialect continuum. But we have evidence such as the word jaguar, which was borrowed to Proto-Tucanoan and to one of the earliest branch out of Tucano language as Jai or Javi. And in Proto-Arawakan, we have Javi. We can also see that some groups of Proto-Arawakan languages gave a different form with a suffix that we don't see in these other languages. So you can actually be a bit more precise of which languages were not involved in the borrowing of this word as well. And here's the distribution of the language that have the same etymon for the word of jaguar, which are Tucanoans and Arawakans. In the word for manioc, which is related to agriculture, we have a very similar pattern, although there is more phonetic variation in how than in the word for jaguar, which suggests, or not suggests, which confirms actually that the borrowings from Arawakan was not directly for a single proto-language, Proto-Tucanoa language, but to a stage where some of the Tucanoa language had already branched out. Since the borrowings do not follow neatly regular sound correspondence. Actually, they show pairwise similarity more with potential donor Arawakan language than between the Tucano language themselves in some regard. This is the word for manioc, which is also involved. Now we go to the classic period where I actually see that there was a division of the Eastern Tucano languages between Western and Eastern. And along this division, we have ethnologists have predicted this process from analyzing myths and other aspects of social behavior. And this anthropologist, Raicho Domatov, he argues that this process that we see in the map here was actually fundamental for the formation of specific social order that applies to the Tucanoan groups, such as patriarchality and exogamy. one particular etymon that we found shared exactly by only Eastern Tucanoan groups is the word for ayahuasca, right? Which we saw already in the Desano myth, and which encompass only these Eastern Tucanoan languages, Dadahup, other languages here, and Arawakan languages that you can see in blue here. Other languages, other Tucanoan languages like Cubeo and the Western Tucanoans, they have different etymologies. They don't have the same borrowing from Arawakan in this case. So to show you this more clearly, a word for ayahuasca is shared pretty much by all Arawakan languages except a group that's outside this area. And in Tucanoan, it's shared by only the Eastern Tucanoan groups that we saw. And this is related, I have to skip a bit more so I don't go too much over time, but we also find evidence of more subtle shift in the vocabulary of Tucanoan languages as a result of what we call contact with Arawakans and a process of Arawakization. In cultural terms, we see this as a development of more fishermen or riverine lifeways and specialization in bitter manioc as the main staple food in their agricultural systems. We can see also that some elements can be reconstructed to Proto-Tucanoan, others cannot. And one particular lexical element that's interesting is the word for aquatic beings, such as turtle, capybara, and the stingray. All of these in the Eastern Tucanoan languages are compound terms. And the simple terms refer to the counterpart of the animal that live in the jungle. So for instance, turtle and the tortoise. So there is aquatic turtle and land turtle. The land turtle is basically ko'u, and this is river tortoise. Tapir, which is the largest mammal in the Amazon or in the Americas, is weku. But capybara, which is the largest rodent, but which lives mostly in the water, it's called river tapir. Snake, anya, but stingray, because it stings just like a snake, is called river snake. So you see that there is an adaptation to the vocabulary, as we also see adaptation to riverine lifeways. The final example I'd like to show, it also goes along with the word wa'i, the etymon wa'i. It is reconstructible to Proto-Tucanoan as meat and flesh with no distinction. And in Western Tucanoan, we can use the word wa'i to name animals you hunt, and the meat you eat, or the flesh from your body, you always use wa'i. But fish is called small river, sorry, not small, river wa'i. So wa'i from the river. This is quite different from what we see in Eastern Tucanoan. In Eastern Tucanoan, the basic term refers to fish, while we have specific terms to refer to flesh. The I, this is an Arawakan borrowing, and wa'i, this means big fish. So the big protein animal that lives in the forest. This is what we hunt. So basic term for what you fish, and a derived term from what you hunt. And the Western Tucano is quite the opposite. So this shift in vocabulary that we tend to see as a direction from where the Eastern Tucano are the ones that are shifting. This represents a change in this social organization from more forest residents to riverine peoples. This is the final outcome when we have the Arawakan introduction into this area, the arrival of the Carib groups in a more recent time. This time is pretty much based on glottochronology from previous research. And this is when we have the complete separation of the Eastern Tucanoan, since no other Tucanoan groups stayed here. All the others migrated to this area, into this area as well. While they were migrating, the Eastern Tucanoans passed through this more intense social language change process, which is also related to cultural process as well. I saved this example for another time in case you wonder, but this is just another example referring now to change in grammar, in possession strategies that also show borrowings, structural borrowings, as well as more direct morpheme borrowings from Arawakan to Tucanoan. And we can now go back and make a synthesis of what we've seen in terms of the Tucanoan and Arawakan histories. We can understand that the Arawakan voyages in Clan history and Arawakan expansions might be referring to process that happened at this stage. The peach palm myth might be referring to process that occurred in between the formative and the classic, to the extent that it talks about how Eastern Tucanoans got agriculture from their in-laws, right? From people that were foreigner and that they were marrying with. And this goes along the process of language contact, contact-induced changes from Arawakan to Tucanoan. And the other myth of the sino-linguistic diversity that we kind of started our talk, this is more related to the post-classic, when the Tucanoans invade the Valpais, and there is a real foundation of a new social order by this moment. Now, the remaining puzzle. Why? How come linguistics, archaeology, and ethnology are making predictions that is so distinct from the predictions of or from what is being said by the mythological narratives? And this is not an easy way to solve this, but there are possible ways to look at it. One is to understand that as Arawakans are expansive groups, it has been observed that when they migrate to a new place, they baptize the whole new toponyms that they found with names that already existed in the areas where they migrated from. And the places are named in the way that you can tell the mythological histories, the same mythological histories, but referring to new places in a new territory. This has been called the migrating mythscapes of Arawakan, and this might explain that, okay, maybe that center that we see here is not the only center. Every time the Arawakans migrate, they create a new center. So it's part of their ideology of expanding and recreating centers of creation and expansion. Now, for the Tucanoans, we have this combination of downriver to upriver migration and the topic of the anaconda canoe. So the anaconda was a huge anaconda that was carrying people. The movement from downriver to upriver that we see here, we also see with another major ceramic tradition called the Amazonia polychrome, which is not the same tradition that the Arawakans brought here. And in the Amazonia polychrome, what distinguishes it from other ceramic traditions is it's the presence of anaconda or snake motifs, especially the anaconda. So it's possible that the Tucanoans are local to this area, but in the process of, let's say, interethnic relations with Arawakans and perhaps other people, but likely Arawakans that adopted the Amazonia polychrome at this stage, they inherited this ideology of a migration from the south and the anaconda motifs as well. Okay, and now I give you my final words about the main questions I raised in the beginning. So models that explain linguistic diversity. I think when we compare the Sano and Baniwa, we actually see two different perspectives about how language diversity is evaluated by different groups, and how their myths might retell different process that apply to these people. the opposition the Sano and Baniwa, or Baniwa and the Sano, is similar to the opposition we saw between farming language dispersion theory and the Nick Evans multilingual theory to some extent as well. And what I think is interesting, provoking some sense, is that what sort of native perspectives about this linguistic diversification process they can illuminate us to understand global process. So in the case of the Sano, exogamy and patrilinearity and organization into clans and autonomous language communities, this might reveal in the future that one important aspect of linguistic diversity in a world scale is not so much the issue of expansions, but also of resistance or permanence of linguistic diversity in some areas that have for a long time produced and kept high linguistic diversity. And as we go also to conclude about the role of multidisciplinary and epistemological research, I think we could illustrate some case of confirmation, complementarity, and that contradictions, sorry for the typo, can be resolved by triangulations whenever possible, and by making interpretations about what exactly archaeological records, indigenous people, and languages are referring to. We have to remember that language, people, culture, identity, they do not act as a globe. So when we look at prehistory, we have to be able to separate and see how these different narratives we have put all of these pieces together. Well, that's all I had to tell you. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm really sorry I passed considerably from the time allotted to me. But thank you for listening until now.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, le timing était absolument parfait, il n'y a aucun souci là-dessus. J'imagine qu'il doit y avoir plein de questions. Et donc, vous avez la parole. La salle virtuelle a la parole. Moi, j'avais une petite question d'ignare. J'ai du mal à me figurer le degré d'intercompréhension entre les langues que vous nous avez présentées, en particulier aujourd'hui pour le linguiste qui travaille.
Donc, la question, c'est si les langues tucano et arawak sont similaires.
Oui, le degré, oui, c'est ça, la possibilité d'intercompréhension.
Non, elles sont très différentes en relation à la grammaire, les lexiques, bien sûr. Par exemple, les tucano sont plutôt suffixants. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de préfixes. Et les langues arawak utilisent beaucoup de préfixes. Ils ont aussi beaucoup de catégories grammaticaux qui sont différents. Et la phonologie, non, la phonologie, c'est plutôt pareil. C'est similaire avec un peu de consonnes et peu de voyelles, avec des systèmes de tons restrictifs, des tons A, O et bas. Mais ils sont tout à fait différents de son point de vue. Ils ne sont pas compréhensibles. Mais les langues tucano, elles sont plutôt comme la famille romane. Est-ce qu'on a dit comme ça en français, la famille romane?
Romane, oui.
Romane, oui. Donc, c'est plutôt ces degrés de diversité entre les langues. La famille arawak, le branch, non, la partie qui s'est localisée à le nord-ouest Amazon, elle est parfois comme ça, non, comme la famille latine romaine, mais la grosse famille arawak qui s'est distribuée des Caraïbes au sud d'Amérique du Sud, ils sont très distants, très distants. Donc, le multilinguisme, quand il est partagé entre les langues arawak et tucano, c'est pas une chose qu'on peut parler les deux langues ou les langues des deux familles juste pour connaître les traits qui sont similaires. Il faut vraiment avoir une capacité d'apprendre et parler les deux différemment.
Merci beaucoup. Émilie?
Oui, merci. J'aurais deux questions à vous poser. La première, c'est vous avez évoqué ce mythe de la maison des champs, donc qui raconte, qui donne une explication de la diversité des langues. J'aurais souhaité savoir s'il y avait d'autres mythes dans ces différents groupes culturels qui pouvaient expliquer la diversité des langues. Ça, c'est première question. Et la deuxième question, est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire un petit peu plus sur la façon dont ces groupes nomment leur langue? Est-ce que c'est en lien avec la géographie, donc leur point d'origine ou leur point d'arrivée? Est-ce que c'est en lien avec leur nom ethnique ou est-ce que c'est complètement autre chose? Et est-ce que ces noms de langue constituent un type d'information qui vous est utile dans votre recherche?
Excellent les questions. En fait, pour la deuxième question sur les noms de langues, oui, les noms de langues, ils sont nommés surtout sous les noms du clan ou de la ethnicité. Ça, c'est les causes, les patrons de Eastern Tucanoa. De Western Tucanoa, il y a beaucoup de groupes dans la littérature historique qui sont connus surtout sous les noms de chaque rivière, de chaque petit rivière ou de lieu qu'ils habitent. Donc, en fait, c'est vraiment différent l'organisation sociale entre Eastern Tucanoan et Western Tucanoan, et ça donne aussi des raisons différentes de distinguer le bord culturel, la frontière culturelle et linguistique entre les groupes, et comme ils ont des différentes idéologies et stratégies pour nommer les langues entre les deux. Donc, les langues Western Tucano sont plutôt un gros dialecte continu qu'on peut, aujourd'hui, c'est pour marquer la transition, mais peut-être dans le passé a été plus factible d'avoir un gros dialecte continu depuis les Caquetá vers l'ouest. Mais les langues, par contre, les langues tucano-orientaux, les Eastern Tucanoan, ils sont déjà beaucoup mélangés. Ils sont des mouvements de dispersion après une division de la famille. Donc, c'est des patrons différents de distribution spatiale et de segmentation de chaque famille, de chaque rame de la famille. Et, pardon, je m'oubliais de la première question. Est-ce que vous pouvez...
La première question, c'était simplement de savoir s'il y avait d'autres mythes qui expliquaient la diversité des langues. Vous avez parlé de la maison des champs. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres histoires?
Oui, il y a des histoires quand on avance sur le temps de la narrative et quand chaque groupe va faire référence à son propre histoire, l'histoire du clan. Donc, l'histoire de la maison des Chantes, c'est partagé pour beaucoup des autres groupes. Mais après ce moment, il y a des développements et chaque groupe va parler de son propre histoire. Et dans ces cas, c'est possible d'identifier des autres histoires qui, par exemple, vont dire non, nous avons de notre langue depuis la maison des Chantes, mais à cause de se marier avec ce groupe, on a changé pour les autres langues. Donc, il y a des histoires complémentaires qui vont donner spécificité de chaque groupe et pourquoi ils parlent de langues différentes ou pourquoi ils parlent la même langue que ses voisins, par exemple, ou les peuples qui ils font des mariages. Et juste pour complémenter, pardon, de la même façon que les chants, la maison des chants parle de la création de multiples langues, il y a aussi des histoires qui parlent de la perte de la langue aussi, non? Donc, je n'ai pas parlé beaucoup sur les processus de toucanisation des Arawaks, que ça a été un chapitre de l'histoire qui c'est plus récent que la arawakisation de Tucano. Mais pendant les cours de la toucanisation des Arawaks, beaucoup de groupes Arawaks vont perdre ces langues et vont parler de langue Tucano. Et donc, il y a des groupes qui vont expliquer ça comme une façon plutôt mémorielle, historique, et des autres groupes qui vont mettre ça dans un chapitre de ses mythologies. Ils vont parler des processus magiques et des rituels des ancêtres qui expliquent la perte de la langue, par exemple.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois qu'il y a une autre question. Justin?
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Merci, c'était très intéressant. J'avais une question par rapport à la séparation entre les groupes occidentaux et les groupes orientaux. Bon, j'ai vu qu'il y avait un contact intense avec les groupes arawak, plus intense en fait, avec les groupes orientaux. Mais vous avez dit aussi qu'il y avait une influence sur le groupe proto-Tucano avant cette séparation. Et je voulais savoir si vous pouvez dire quelque chose de plus là-dessus et à quel point est-ce qu'il y avait cette influence arawak.
D'accord. Donc, ça, c'est un point de l'histoire que c'est, bien sûr, c'est très éloigné, un peu nébuleuse pour moi. Et d'abord, je pensais que j'ai été en train d'identifier des empreintes non linguistiques entre Proto-Japura, Colômbia et Proto-Arawak de cette région et Proto-Tucano. Mais quand on analyse la phonologie de ces empruntements, par exemple, comme j'ai montré avec les mots pour manioc, on voit qu'il y a en fait un peu plus de diversité dans cette réflexe des empruntements. Donc, ça me donne un doute si c'est à cause déjà une situation de différenciation entre les premières rames de la famille Tucano. Il y a par contre aussi des éléments, par exemple, grammaticaux, qui semblent être plutôt généraux. Donc, les pronoms ou les marques de personnes pour la trois personnes plurielles, c'est na ou ran. Et ça, c'est le même pour toutes les langues tucano et toutes les langues arawak aussi. Et il y a des autres morphèmes grammaticaux qui nous donnent sécurité, non, qui nous assurent qu'il y a plusieurs des empreintes grammaticaux dans ces langues, ce qui est différent de ce qui a été décrit pour les régions de Balpès en temps plus récent, par Sacha Eichenwald, notre collègue aussi. Donc, quand on analyse l'histoire ancienne, on voit plus des empruntements et des convergences de langues directes que plus récemment. Donc, pour essayer de répondre à votre question, pardon, en fait, je ne suis pas clair à ce moment si on peut trouver des vrais empreintes pour proto-tucano ou si les empreintes sont déjà diffusées parmi des langues tucano un peu déjà diversifiées en 2, 3 rangs de la famille. Donc, c'est en fait un topic de la recherche qui doit être plus précisé pour le futur.
Ok, merci.
Bernard
Et oui,
Colomba.
merci beaucoup pour ce bel exposé. Moi, la question que je me posais, c'est comment vous aviez accès au côté historique ou diachronique, parce que vous avez donné beaucoup d'éléments là-dessus, et par quel support vous pouvez y accéder, quel support vous utilisez, si vous utilisez des supports. Mis à part les langues elles-mêmes et ce qu'on peut savoir de l'évolution des langues, mais est-ce qu'il y a des supports écrits?
Ah, bien sûr, c'est ça l'idée de support. Je n'ai pas compris au début, mais c'est ça. OK. Euh, donc, les premières méthodes utiles qu'on utilise, c'est les méthodes comparatives. Donc, c'est plutôt des comparaisons des langues orales et la reconstruction de ces langues. Mais à ce moment, j'essaie de grandir les bases de données. Et pour ça, on cherche beaucoup de données historiques. Mais les données historiques sont des listes de mots très limitées, non, des données linguistiques. Non? Donc, pour les langues tucano-orientales, les plus anciennes données linguistiques sont des listes de 1820. Euh, euh, plus ou moins. Et pour les données des langues western tucanoises, c'est la moitié du siècle XVIII. Donc, une différence de 70 années entre les deux, pas beaucoup. Et ils sont très fragmentaires, la plupart, mais on peut déjà avoir ce que je cherche, ce n'est pas juste des enregistrements des langues anciennes avec des représentatifs modernes, ça c'est intéressant, mais aussi des variétés qui sont disparues entre les siècles. Non? Donc j'essaie d'utiliser beaucoup d'informations de ces langues extinguées et des variétés aussi. Et bon, et il y a déjà des travaux que j'ai fait, des autres collègues ont fait aussi, qui fait la reconstruction du lexique et la classification avec du lexique aussi, de la phonologie et de certains aspects grammaticaux aussi, soit de langue tucane, soit de langue arhuaque aussi. Donc, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire encore pour la reconstruction et l'étude des contacts du passé, mais je crois que cette région de l'Amazonie sont aujourd'hui entre les plus bien connaître dans un point de vue du passé linguistique. Est-ce qu'il y a une autre sorte de support peut-être que vous avez pensé que je n'ai pas mentionné?
Non, simplement, j'ai travaillé sur des textes anciens où on utilisait, par exemple, le Notre Père, l'oraison dominicale, comme on dit Oratio Dominica, pour comparer les langues dans la tradition occidentale. Mais c'est tout à fait autre chose parce que ça remonte plus loin. Mais il y a des choses intéressantes sans doute à chercher de ce côté-là, mais sans doute pas dans votre domaine parce que là, je pense que les témoignages écrits ne sont pas nombreux. S'ils remontent au 19e siècle, comme vous l'avez dit, ça semble difficile.
Oui, c'est vrai. Dans le côté de Western Tucanoan, l'activité jésuitique et capuchinien et franciscain, c'est un peu plus intensive et plus ancienne que dans le côté de Eastern Tucanoan. Donc, c'est possible on peut trouver des données dans les archives aussi des organisations religieuses et gouvernementales. On a pas mal de données sur les catéchismes de langue siona, non? Il y a pas mal de données sur cette langue-là. Et c'est intéressant parce que quelqu'un a dit que peut-être cette langue a été un koiné ou une langue franche, língua franca de la région. C'est une chose qui doit être investiguée mieux. Mais Paul Rivet aussi, en français, ici à Paris, il a des archives aussi qu'on peut essayer de trouver s'il y a des autres langues ouest tucano qui ont été enregistrées par les religieux, non, qui ont été parmi eux. Donc, c'est possible de trouver quelque chose dans la côté de l'Ouest tucano plus ancien et plus systématisé, comme un catécisme ou des autres données. Mais pour la côté Eastern Tucano, non. Je crois qu'on a déjà la chance pour avoir des enregistrements de 1820.
Merci.
Bien.
Franck?
Bonjour, merci pour cette présentation. J'ai été frappé du nombre de langues isolées au milieu d'une telle variété. Je me demandais, est-ce qu'il y a une explication?
Oui, bonne question. Je crois qu'il y a beaucoup d'idées pour expliquer ça. Et peut-être parmi ces idées, il y a pas mal d'idées vraies, non, qui sont correctes, expliquent différentes façons de langues isolées, non? Je crois qu'une explication doit être l'extinction des autres langues qui sont liées génétiquement à ces langues. Donc, sont des langues isolées, peut-être sont les ultimes qui ont survécu, non? Qui survivre dans une période d'extinction. Je travaille avec une langue dite non isolée, mais avec la comparaison des variétés historiques, on peut peut-être nous demander si c'est vraiment un cas d'une langue isolée avec une variété chronotype, chronolétique, ou si c'est vraiment un cas d'une famille linguiste avec deux langues. Donc, cette chose-là, c'est peut-être relationné, non, avec, lié avec les choses des langues isolées. Une autre chose, c'est le manque de données et le manque aussi des études comparatives. Je crois que c'est possible que dans le futur, on peut trouver plus de relations génétiques. Mais c'est aussi vrai qu'on on a essayé de connecter les langues génétiquement et on n'a pas réussi encore dans le cadre d'interprétation plus conservative. Donc, oui, donc c'est une chose, on doit faire plus d'investigations, mais peut-être c'est le cas, non? On ne peut pas utiliser les méthodes existantes, modernes, pour trouver des relations et être confortable avec des résultats avec les méthodes modernes. Donc, c'est une chose d'expandir les travaux, mais peut-être on doit rester avec ça et comprendre que la réalité linguistique d'Amérique s'est caractérisée pour beaucoup de langues isolées et des familles petites ou moyennes.
Merci beaucoup pour cette réponse.
Oui, Justin, je vois qu'il y a une question. Je vous en prie.
Ah oui, merci. C'était juste une question que j'avais par curiosité. Avant, on a pensé qu'il y avait trois branches de la langue tucano, de la famille tucano en fait. Il y avait la branche occidentale, l'orientale et ensuite il y avait la centrale. Et je me demande si tu avais une explication pour pourquoi on pense pas ça encore. On a changé notre idée là-dessus.
Oui, OK. Oh, pardon. Je vais montrer l'arbre de la famille, c'est pour ça. Pas l'arbre, le neighbornet, oui, c'est ici. Donc, ici, ici c'est les langues occidentales, non? Et ici sont les langues qui ont été classifiées comme centrales, comme cubeo, otanimuca, et Coretu, que moi-même j'ai classifié comme occidentaux pour les raisons de la classification phonologique, des innovations phonologiques. Ici, c'est un arbre de rétention lexique. Non? Donc, le problème avec la classification linguistique, c'est que ça change si on choisit des données différentes. Les langues sont bien organisées comme un système, blablabla, mais on sait aussi qu'ils sont des systèmes multiples et qu'ils peuvent changer de différentes façons. Et donc, ils vont nous montrer des relations entre les langues qui sont différentes. Mais on peut vraiment voir qu'il y a quelque chose comme occidentaux qui c'est bien défini et qu'on a aussi notre côté oriental qui c'est bien défini. Mais parmi les centres, il y a beaucoup des autres langues qui sont pas clairement d'un côté à l'autre. Donc, pour les informations que j'ai déjà analysées, innovation lexicale, innovation phonologique et innovation des systèmes verbaux. Ces arbres ici, note bien cette ambiguïté de cette langue ici, mais ce n'est pas le cas de dire qu'il y a une nouvelle branche qui c'est centrale. Et les changements phonologiques de Cubeu et Tanimuca sont très proches ou presque similaires ou les mêmes que de ce côté, c'est plus proche d'ici que d'ici. Donc, à ce moment, je ne crois pas qu'il y a quelque chose de central, mais c'est possible qu'on peut trouver des correctures ou d'autres choses qui sont plus ambiguës. Le problème, c'est de la représentation arboréale aussi. Parce qu'on ne peut pas dire, oh, ça est moitié Eastern, moitié Western. Non, on ne peut pas faire ça comme ça. Donc, une des choses que je travaille à ce moment sont des formes de représentation des relations génétiques et des contacts, comme la glottométrie historique. Non, c'est une des méthodes de classification que je viens d'étudier un petit peu avec Alexandre François, ici à Paris aussi. Et ça me donne des idées très intéressantes pour justement comprendre l'ambiguïté du signal linguistique. Parce que c'est ça qu'on trouve, non? Peut-être que o Cubeu, c'est une langue qui a contact avec les langues tucano-occidentaux, mais aussi un inheritance de features de son ancêtre tucano-oriental. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'ambiguïté dans cette partie des langues tucano. Et je crois que la solution meilleure, ce n'est pas de dire, oh, la classification Western, Eastern, c'est mauvaise, on doit changer, ou choses comme ça, mais avoir clarité. Qu'est-ce qui fait Cubeu être ambigus? Qu'est-ce qui fait ambigus entre les deux côtés de la famille, non? Donc, je crois que ma recherche va dans cette direction, dans ce moment, qui est de revisiter un débat qui il est né d'abord avec une distinction purement géographique. Eastern Tucanoan, Western Tucanoan. Après, il vient, les chercheurs de l'Institut linguistique, de Summer Institute of Linguistics, il fait une classification de rétention lexique et dit non, Cubeu c'est central. Et après, ça s'ajoute Tanimuka. Mais c'est juste impressionnisme. C'est juste pour question impressionniste. Donc, si je suis plutôt intéressé, qu'est-ce que sont des données qui montrent l'ambiguïté de la classification de ces langues. Et après, on peut voir si on peut faire une synthèse classificatoire, qu'on peut et voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut chercher. Mais pour moi, ce n'est pas vraiment productif à ce moment de combattre ou d'affirmer une de cette version, même ce que j'ai fait dans le passé, non? Mais pour moi, c'est mieux de construire une histoire plus détaillée et que ce n'est pas vraiment binaire comme on essayait d'abord.
Oui, merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup pour m'écouter et pour le temps qu'on a passé ensemble. Je suis désolé d'avoir parlé beaucoup. Je sais que les topics sont un peu durs parce qu'ils parlent beaucoup des choses spécifiques de l'Amazonie et tout ça, mais j'espère que je pourrai communiquer bien quelques idées centrales de ma recherche. Et donc, merci pour les questions aussi et pour l'espace de pouvoir présenter et discuter ma recherche avec vous.
Merci beaucoup et encore une fois, aucun souci sur le temps. C'était important de pouvoir prendre le temps d'exposer clairement et surtout qu'on n'est pas tous familiers avec le sujet, loin s'en faut. Merci infiniment et bravo.